Jim Woodall about prosecutorial ethics and charging decisions. So thank you. And Natalia, you want to take it from here?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I think I'm actually just going to turn it over to Steve Mange with DOJ, and he's going to introduce two speakers. We'll hear from both of them, and then we'll have time for a discussion, including any questions that you have from them and of the memo that Steve sent out, which has some different options for how we might want to think about a recommendation coming out of today. Steve,
Great. Thank you, Natalia, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to assist in thinking about this issue. We are really lucky to lead off with two national experts on marijuana legalization, decriminalization, and regulation. So I'm going to introduce them, and then, as Natalia said, we decided it'd be more efficient to let them both do their presentations and then save the remaining 45 minutes or so for Q&A, discussion, and so forth. So Dr. Silver is a pediatrician and public health advocate who serves as senior advisor at the Public Health Institute and also a clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. She's worked as a consultant to the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and served as Assistant Health Commissioner of the New York City Health Department under Mayor Bloomberg, and also as a health officer for Sonoma County, California. She has published extensively, both in the scientific literature and the popular press, on public health issues. And she received her MD and MPH degrees and pediatric training from Johns Hopkins University. I also did want to mention for the discussion portion, we're joined by a colleague of Lynn's with expertise in this topic as well. Arash Sarush, who also goes by Jason, is on with us as well. Our second presenter, Bo Kilmer, is director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center and is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Bo's publications have appeared in leading journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And his many commentaries have been published by CNN, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Newsweek, San Francisco Chronicle, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and many other media outlets. He has co-authored a book on cannabis legalization, recently published by Oxford University Press, as well as a book on the future of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids published by RAND. Bo received his BA in International Relations from Michigan State, his master's in public policy from UC Berkeley, and his PhD in public policy from Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful experts today. And Lynn Silver, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's an honor to be with you. I hope I don't say too many legally foolish things. So I am a pediatrician venturing into territory that's probably beyond my competence. So please correct me if I get any of that wrong. But I'll do my best here, because where I'm coming from with this is really the concern about protecting public health, protecting young people, and equity, why we try to address the other consequences of our past policies in marijuana. Actually, are you seeing the divided presentation there? Let me try and switch back.
Lynn, I think you can switch back. You can switch back again. Yeah. So we're seeing the your PowerPoint here. So I think you're good.
Okay, you're seeing just the slide, not the presenter's view.
Correct. I think you're in good shape.
Okay, good, because I'm seeing both on my screens here. So first, my name is Lynn Silver, as Steve introduced you, and we have a project at the Institute called Getting It Right from the Start, which is an optimistic and overambitious name, but trying to express the hope that if the country does move towards legalization, that it does so in a much more prudent and thoughtful way. Our product has been working to try and develop and test models and provide technical assistance on policies that can reduce harm, youth, and problem use by promoting social equity and safety. We've worked with over 100 states and local jurisdictions in the US and Canada. and have produced model laws working with the legal community for use in California local jurisdictions. So going back to the basics, why did people, or many of us, support or think about legalizing and decriminalizing? For many of us, not all of us, that came out of concerns of systemic racism in the way that policies were being enforced, large-scale incarceration, the violence associated with trafficking and its social impacts, and the simple fact that the prohibition was not working, that a large part of our population continued to use these products despite their illegality. In North Carolina in particular, we see that this is based on the North Carolina Youth-Related Behavior Surveys, and we see that the current penalty-based approach is simply not working to keep kids or adults from using, with half of North Carolina 12th graders reporting ever use, over a quarter, 9th graders, 7% before age 13, 15% of 9th graders and 29% of 12th graders are currently using, and a quarter have been offered drugs in their school premises. So our current policies are not working to protect our kids. But in addition to that, even after the measures that North Carolina already took, and this is an important report from the ACLU on marijuana-related arrests, North Carolina is far from the worst in racial disparities in the country at number 31, but Blacks were still over 3 times more likely to be arrested, and marijuana possession arrests were still accounting for about 53% of drug arrests, according to this report. And unfortunately, those disparities between 2010 and 2018 did not improve. And we are still seeing significant trends in arrests for marijuana possession even after 2010 and through 2018 in this ACLU data, which came from the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Database. So the first conclusion is that even these important steps that have been taken to date to reduce injustice in arrests and consumption are insufficient, which leads to the question, is legalization of sales, as several states have pursued, the solution? There are many reasons we should be concerned about racing forward to legalize sales. Why reefer madness was not correct. Marijuana is also not the best thing since sliced bread, and it has significant negative health effects, including low birth weight when used during pregnancy, and pregnancy use has increased dramatically over the last decade. Schizophrenia and psychosis being increased, increased motor vehicle crashes, respiratory illnesses, and clear evidence that early and frequent use increases bad outcomes for young people and the likelihood of dependency. We are seeing bodies of emerging evidence of cognitive, academic, and social effects, increasing accidental ingestion and overdose, and growing evidence around heart disease caused by marijuana use. So all of these are areas for concern. At the same time, there are some valid medical uses, although they are also often exaggerated in scope. In particular, why adolescent use, the data is conflicting on whether it's increased with legalization. We have clearly seen a very large scale increase in use in young adults age 18 to 22, which has now reached a 35-year high at 43% after a long period of decline in the 90s and early 2000s. And most concerningly, we're seeing a real increase in daily and near daily use, which is the people who are getting in trouble, not the person who's smoking at an occasional party, but the people who are using every day. That has gone up in college age youth, whether in college or out of college, quite dramatically. And part of that is about the phenomena of where the cannabis industry is going nationally. And I understand North Carolina has been a major activist on the Juul lawsuits, for example, and has played a very important role. And I will tell you, if you guys don't like Juul, you will really hate where the modern cannabis industry is going, because it's following in their footsteps. Vaping of marijuana and nicotine each doubled for US college students in a single year between 2017 and 2018, and continued to go up. And we are seeing a rapidly changing landscape of commercial production, promotion, product diversification, increasing potency, and new routes of administration that the Surgeon General of the United States is characterized as not your mama's marijuana any longer. It's a very different market out there. We're seeing three trends in particular that are very concerning and where they're really taking a page from the tobacco industry playbook. The first is manipulating the potency, which increases the risk of addiction and psychosis. The second is creating flavored and other products aimed at attracting youth. And the third trend is aggressive and misleading marketing. I'm just going to go through some pictures. 80% of kids who start using tobacco start with flavored products. The cannabis industry is marketing exactly the same types of products. We are allowing high potency products to multiply that I believe will create a substantial added burden of serious mental illness because of their effects on psychosis. This is just one example of a somewhat nerdy study, but a 5-fold increase in psychotic disorder in people who used high potency cannabis daily. And that is not good. We don't do well as a society with our patients with psychosis and schizophrenia, and our streets are full of people who are not getting sufficient support. So anything that makes that worse is a potential problem. Some of you lawyers may remember this decision from Judge Kessler in the big RICO suit, US v. Philip Morris. The defendants have long known that nicotine creates and sustains an addiction to smoking, and that cigarette sales and ultimately profits depend on creating and sustaining that addiction. Defendants have designed their cigarettes to precisely control nicotine delivery levels and provide doses sufficient to create and sustain addiction. I don't know if the industry is doing that purposefully in cannabis or just to give people a better high, but we are seeing very similar trends in the cannabis industry. So to what extent are our policies addressing these challenges where legalization is moving forward across the country? And I'll give you the example of California as an example not to follow. California state law allows rampant marketing. It places no restrictions on potency or flavors. It allows health and therapeutic claims, most of which are misleading. It places no restrictions on number of stores or delivery licenses unless local government does so. Local control was overrode to allow delivery anywhere. It does not control discounting, and there is no priority of equity licensing, for example. So I would say the California framework is a bad example to follow. I'm just going to show you some pictures of what we're seeing in California to give you an idea of how not well done legalization can look. Pink animal cracker pre-rolls, cannabis infused root beer, Pride rainbow sherbet, guess who that's targeting? Sprig orange soda, hi-fi hops, grape flavored blunts infused with extra concentrate to be more potent. This is your basic Juul-like memory stick of very high potency marijuana, hot pink to attract my daughter. That's equivalent to about 30 joints from when I was in college. These are billboards that are all over California. Best buds, delivering more joy than dogs and babies combined. This is when outdoor temporary event permits were allowed, grasslands. And widespread framing, just as the tobacco industry did and the patent medicine industry did, as wellness or lifestyle products, claiming to cure pretty much anything, depression, cancer, appetite, and so forth. I'm not making this up, folks. So the potential consequences of unfettered commercial promotion can also have an impact on health and on health disparities. For example, in the Black community, low birth weight has long been a major problem. But if we increase consumption in vulnerable communities, we'll see increases in low birth weight. We'll see increases in substance abuse and increases in psychosis and mental health issues, which already have more devastating outcomes for low income and minority communities. So what do? How do we get the benefits of ending marijuana-related arrests without creating a new tobacco-like industry? That's how I view the essential challenge. How do we get out of what we've been doing wrong without getting into a whole new pot of trouble? And I would say, kind of as a general principle, go boldly in decriminalizing possession, yet slowly and carefully in legalizing sales. A first win for equity, I think, is to really end those low-level marijuana possession arrests and penalties. And you've had several options presented to you by the by the group that organized this. These do not work. I would say consider no penalties for possession under an ounce. To the extent that we funnel young youth of color into unnecessary interactions with the police rather than with mentors, peer counselors, health counselors, and other resources, or just school, we are not necessarily doing something helpful. So I would say if we can do no penalties at any age, no jail, no fines, no increased repeat penalties, but redirect savings from not enforcing these issues to make sure that we have school and community-based mental health resources, youth education, mentoring, and prevention resources, so that we do have somewhere to act and help these youth who are falling into substance abuse, and to educate and to do campaigns. That is a better solution. Why we don't want young people using them, steering them into the justice system, a strategy we've tested for years, has not worked. For me, the ideal would be for it to be a civil infraction with no penalty. I don't know if that's where I get lost as a pediatrician. Can you have a civil infraction with no penalty? So it's still a no-no, but you're not putting people in jail. And most importantly, you're not putting people into the unpaid fine cycle. Because one thing we want to avoid is that vicious and well-known cycle. Someone gets a fine, they can't pay it, they don't pay it. They get 3 of those fines, they have 3 unpaid fines, they get a driver's license, the driver's license gets taken away because they have unpaid fines, they can't drive to work, so they lose their job, and so on. This is a very well-documented cycle. I think Durham, North Carolina is one of the cities that's doing a no fine or reducing fines pilot as part of a national program. So if you can stay away from fines, one option is no penalties and really creating these alternative resources. A civil infraction with just community service is another option, but might still involve youth with law enforcement in ways that may not be completely necessary. So whether to go with legalization of possession at low levels or to go with a civil infraction with the lowest no penalty or the lowest possible penalties, you guys probably understand better than I do, but I think we want to stay away from the fine cycle and from as many justice involvement interactions as possible, because we know they play out unjustly in the community. A second immediate win for equity is to automatically expunge criminal records for marijuana possession. This is critical. By doing this, you can relieve the burden on finding housing, employment, education loans for hundreds of thousands of people. And I don't know what the actual number is in North Carolina, but it's a lot of people. You can help people be successful in their lives and remove unnecessary barriers to success. Code for America has been very helpful and has developed tools to facilitate automatic expungement that are being used in California and in Illinois. They have a project called Clear My Record. You need to establish a time limit, 1 year, 2 years, for the DAs to do this. DA Woodall might have comments on this. What we did see in California was just having the right to expunge, which was in our initial ballot initiative, was inadequate, and very few people made use of it because it was too expensive, too complicated, people didn't know. So 2 years late, within 2 years, the state moved to an automatic expungement process, which is in course, and we'd strongly recommend that. Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and Vermont have all gone that way. So this is a second thing that I think can easily and should be prioritized. If you do decide to study legalization of the broader market, I would say go slowly. You do not have the pressure, from what I understand in North Carolina, of the ballot initiative, which is forcing the issue, signature-driven ballot initiatives in other states. So you probably have more of the luxury of time to study thoughtful solutions. Don't rush to follow the pack. Think about policies that avoid the emergence of a new, strong for-profit industry like the tobacco industry. Consider a state-directed nonprofit monopoly. Quebec is doing this. Governor Raimondi in Rhode Island proposed this. There are also interesting models in Uruguay and DC. Treat this as a public health issue like tobacco and not primarily as an economic development issue. So it is being treated as an economic and taxation opportunity in some states, but it generates, if done badly, it generates costs in mental illness and other areas that can outweigh the revenue. and build a better way. We need examples of places that are doing this better. And I hope that if North Carolina does decide to move forward on legalizing sales at some point, that you provide one of those better examples that we urgently would need. If you do legalize supply at some point, go slow, regulate products, restrict high potency, grape flavored blunts, all of these flavored products and beverages designed to attract kids, limit marketing, clearly inform consumers of health risks in ways that is not occurring in other states right now, learning from tobacco control, limit the number of stores, tax and do not allow, 2 for and half off and 50% discounts on Mondays. Capture the tax revenue for prevention and health equity and to invest in our youth, and protect smoke-free air. Protect equity in hiring. If you do allow a for-profit model, which I do not recommend, then make the licenses social equity licenses. Do not allow conflicts of interest in advisory or regulatory bodies. We would not allow the tobacco industry to regulate tobacco nowadays, but in many states, the cannabis industry is very actively involved in leading regulation, resulting in regulatory capture. And lastly, don't expect the illicit market to disappear quickly. That is not happening. It is a slow and gradual process, and it takes time. So let's build solid guardrails to protect youth and public health in this process. Just talking about equity, what really makes for equity in cannabis policies? So I would say first and foremost, ending unjust criminal application of criminal justice and penalties. But also it's reducing the disparities in health and educational outcomes that are driven either by substance abuse or by arrests and having an arrest on your record and helping our youth thrive. Avoiding the creation of new industries that will prey on the most vulnerable, just as the tobacco and alcohol industries have done, and making sure that if there are new systems of sales, that those systems don't recreate the cycle of incarceration to protect the new economic interests that have been created. If you have for-profit licensing, then you should have social equity licenses, but I personally don't believe that the equity issues around cannabis legalization are primarily about making sure people of color own the businesses any more than having Black people own the liquor stores in a poor community assures equity. If for-profit is the way you go, we should assure that, but it won't solve the fundamental equity problems of health and well-being by itself. So just a couple more slides. North Carolina has a very interesting model. You have your ABC model. It's an old but effective homegrown model. It may not be popular and sexy these days when there's a lot of pressure to privatize alcohol distribution. But in fact, alcohol retail monopolies work. North Carolina is the 9th lowest state in the nation in binge drinking. And extensive research has found that the alcohol monopoly strategy reduced problem drinking. And then when it was privatized, it increased. Quebec, for example, which has long had an alcohol monopoly, created a provincial public monopoly for cannabis retailing, and it is seeing better results and lower growth. Like alcohol, in cannabis, 80% of the sales go to a very small number of heavy users. In the US, where it's federally legal, we would probably need a nonprofit intermediary instead of a public entity, but it can still be done. This is Quebec's cannabis market with plain packaging and prominent yellow warning labels. And what they're seeing is a much slower growth in use with this model compared to other provinces. Because it's focused not on maximizing sales, but on providing legal access without promoting use. So in summary, I would suggest that we promote equity by eliminating possession penalties, expunging criminal records, investing in youth prevention, education, support, and addiction treatment, but not allowing the emergence of a profit-driven industry of addiction, and protecting youth and vulnerable citizens from the negative health impacts of cannabis and the evolving cannabis market. If you do get into legalizing sales, lead with public health interests and go very thoughtfully and carefully. Thank you. And thanks to all of my team members who've worked on developing this approach.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I really appreciate that whirlwind tour through these complex policy issues. We're now going to turn the microphone over to Bo Kilmer at the RAND Institute. And so, Bo, if you want to share your screen. And Bo, do you want to, you want to maximize the?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now, just making
right.
sure.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay,
You're
great. Well,
you're all set.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, Steve, thank you so much. And I want to thank your colleagues for setting this up. It's an honor to be with everyone here on the work group. And Lynn, thank you very much for the great presentation. I'm going to shift the focus a little bit and spend a bit more time talking about decriminalization as opposed to legalization. But just to provide you a little bit of background about where I'm from, the RAND Corporation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that tries to improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. So I have about 1,000 colleagues that are working on all aspects of public policy, ranging from the environment to labor and education to health and criminal justice. But it's at the national security, but it's at the nexus of the work that we do on health and criminal justice that we have our Drug Policy Research Center, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary. And I work with a number of colleagues on a number of topics related to substance use and drug policy. I just want to make it clear we don't have an official position on legalization or decriminalization, and RAND doesn't support or oppose bills or ballot initiatives. We really try to do the research to kind of help inform these conversations that are happening actually all over the world. And so today, during my presentation in the Q&A, a lot of the insights I'll be discussing are based on a number of collaborations, which led to different books and articles, as well as reports. But it's also been based on, insights that I've had with decision makers as they've been kind of thinking about these issues. So I've done a fair amount of work with the Washington State Liquor Control Board, the state of Vermont when they were considering this, the Governor Cuomo's Blue Ribbon Commission on marijuana regulation. More recently with the Commonwealth of Virginia, kind of help them think about social equity issues. And then also internationally too. So I spent time in Uruguay before they legalized, helped them kind of think through these issues, and then went back afterwards to help them think about how they could evaluate that. And I also spent time working with Canada's legalization task force before they legalized. So it's based on theory, but also based on the interactions I've been having with policymakers like yourselves. So just to follow up on what Lynn said, 3 quick thoughts on legalizing cannabis. I think so much of the discussion about legalization in the United States is based on this false dichotomy that we either need to keep cannabis prohibited or we need to regulate cannabis like alcohol and allow for-profit companies to do the production, distribution, and selling. I think Lynn made it clear there are a lot of other options you have there. For example, you could just allow home grows like Vermont did or Washington, D.C. You could do a state store model. You could limit the participation to nonprofit organizations, or as Lynn had alluded to, kind of, potentially, for benefit corporations, right? If you're going to allow for-profit companies to get involved, at least require that there be a triple bottom line business that focuses on people, planet, and profits. So you have a lot of options here. And you shouldn't just limit, and as these discussions progress, you shouldn't just limit yourself to kind of what you see being implemented in other states. And also, if we look at a lot of the outcomes, the second point I want to make is if you look at a lot of the outcomes that get discussed in legalization debates. So what happens to consumption? What happens to the size of the illicit market? What happens to tax revenues? What happens to the profitability of businesses, which ultimately has implications for social equity? So much of this is actually going to be influenced by the post-tax price, right? The price, and then, because we know that for a number of reasons with legalization, it pushes down the production distribution costs. And in a lot of places, we've seen those prices decline. Now, this is something that you're going to want to pay really close attention to if you go down this path of thinking about legalizing, because what ends up happening to the post-tax price is going to influence so many of the outcomes that you actually care about. I mean, there are a lot of factors you need to consider, but I'd probably say the most important one is what happens to the post-tax price. And the final point I wanted to make is with respect to if you legalize and you allow for-profit companies to, to distribute and produce and sell, realize that if you go down that pathway and then, 5-10 years later, you decide, oh, wait, that wasn't the right thing. We want to try something else. It's a lot harder to put that genie back in the bottle with the for-profit companies and kind of once they get their lobbyists in place. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. You have a lot of options here. You don't necessarily have to jump from prohibition all the way to the kind of for-profit model. But as I said, I want to focus most of my presentation on decriminalization. And I want to make it clear that decriminalization is not legalization. Now, these terms often get used interchangeably, especially in the press, and this leads to a lot of confusion. So when we talk about legalization, we're typically referring to removing the prohibition on cannabis, not only on the supply, and so allowing some type of legal supply, and then also possession for adults. So legalization tends to focus on the supply side as well as possession. Whereas with decriminalization, when we refer to this, it typically refers to keeping possession illegal, but it removes the criminal penalties. So it can still be a civil penalty, a fine, maybe a referral to education or treatment, community service. It's still prohibited, but it's going to just be more like an infraction. But realize with decriminalization, it doesn't usually touch the supply side. And that's why these are very different policies. And in fact, there is a bit of a research base on decriminalization. With respect to legalization, it's just starting to be built. And so it's important to kind of make that distinction because the evidence bases are a bit different. And of course, if you're thinking about reforming drug possession laws, you actually have a lot of different options. So the other issue here is sometimes when people are referring to reforming drug possession laws, they'll just say decriminalization, but there are actually a lot of different levers that you have. For example, in places where drug possession is a felony, you could actually reduce it from being a felony to a misdemeanor. So this is what's referred to as defelonization, where it still would be a criminal offense, but it's going to be a misdemeanor as opposed to a felony. Another option is what we just talked about before, decriminalization, where you take it from being either a misdemeanor or a felony down to something more like a traffic ticket. You also have some pre-booking diversion programs. And then there's another option you have here, a deprioritization by law enforcement. So in fact, just like last week, Washington, D.C. passed a ballot initiative, and that was focused on psilocybin or magic mushrooms and kind of other psychedelic plants. But I raise it because what they did with that initiative is they didn't change the criminal law. They just essentially said that they were going to make the arrest for non-commercial production and possession of psilocybin and these other psychedelic plants kind of one of the lowest priorities for the police department. So it didn't change the criminal law, but it kind of deprioritized that. And then another option is you could potentially legalize possession for adults, but still keep supply prohibited. As we'll talk about in a moment, that raises a lot of kind of sticky issues with respect to, well, if you're going to allow people to possess an ounce, are you going to allow them to grow at home? And so there are a lot of issues you need to think about with respect to that. So, this isn't a new idea. I mean, a number of states have decriminalized now. I mean, the typical story you hear is that there were about a dozen states that decriminalized cannabis possession in the 1970s, and then kind of over time, about another dozen or so did. Most recently, Virginia made possession of less than 1 ounce a civil penalty punishable by a $20 fine. And I think that just went into effect on July 1st of this year. So it's very new. But there is, as I said, there is a research base on this. And I expect that as you have more discussions about this, people are going to try to tell you, well, the research says this or the research says that. So I want to kind of try to help make things a bit clearer for you. And with respect to, what the evidence says, for those kind of early movers that kind of legal or decriminalized in the 1970s, there was a fair amount of research that kind of came out about that, and the results were all over the place. Some of it said it may have increased use, some said it may have decreased, and it turns out that there's a lot of reasons we need to be question these older studies. So essentially what they would do is they would take all the states that they would make a list of here are the decriminalization states, then they would make a list of the non-decriminalization states and then begin making comparisons. But when you kind of really dig into this, as Rosalie Bakula and colleagues did, you realize that there were some people that were in the decriminalization list that really should have been in the non-decriminalization list and vice versa. So you saw a lot of that. And so that's why the results tended to bounce around early on. And in fact, Rob McCoon and colleagues did a really interesting study where they were looking at whether or not people thought that jail was a possibility for a first-time offense for marijuana possession, looking at people who were in decriminalization stage versus those that weren't. And it turns out both of them kind of had the same rate for the share of people who thought that a first-time offense would lead to jail, suggesting that they didn't necessarily really know what the laws were in their states. But more recently, there has, as I said, over time, there have been more places that have decriminalized the possession of cannabis. And so there was a study that was done a couple of years ago, which looked at 5 recent efforts. So when Massachusetts did this in 2008, Connecticut did this in 2011, Rhode Island and Vermont in 2013, and Maryland in 2014. And they were kind of comparing what happened in those states versus what happened in some of the other states. And they found that it led to large decreases in cannabis possession arrests for both youths and adults. And they didn't find any evidence of an increase in the prevalence of cannabis use during their kind of observation period. And following up on that, Plunk et al., and I believe this study might have been in the Journal of American Medical Association, they were also looking at some of the more recent wave of decriminalization states. And they suggested that decriminalization tends to reduce youth arrests in most cases. However, they found that then after those states actually legalized cannabis, that they may have lost some of that benefit, which is a really interesting finding. Because when we talk about on the legalization side, most of the evidence suggests that arrests for adults are going down quite a bit, but for youth, they're either staying the same or there may actually be increasing in some states. But with decriminalization itself, so just kind of having that penalty going from being a criminal offense down to something more like a traffic ticket, it tends to kind of reduce the arrests for both adults and youth. Now, I want to raise this one. I want to kind of highlight this one study for a couple different reasons. So California, it was always, this is going back to that list of 12 or 13 states that decriminalized in 2017. California was always on that list, but California technically did not decriminalize the possession of cannabis until 2011. So it was kind of interesting. So beforehand, if you got caught possessing, it would be a misdemeanor offense, but you'd only get a fine. So there was no risk. So it's kind of in the middle there. So technically they hadn't decriminalized. And so that actually ended up happening in 2011. And there's one study that came out, which was looking at youth, students in California. And they found that after decriminalization of cannabis possession, that it may have increased the prevalence of past month use for California 12th graders by 25%. Now, this is very large. Most of the studies suggest that this has little or no effect. But this study got a fair amount of attention. However, there's been a more recent, and I mention it because if you end up having discussions about decriminalization, I think this study will come up. But there's a new study that just came out, which kind of looks at the data that they use and really challenges this on a number of levels. First of all, in California at that time, realized that in 2010, California voted on cannabis legalization. So there already was a tremendous amount of attention to cannabis legalization kind of at that time, so that may have actually kind of affected the results. Also, there was no effect in terms of what it meant for the younger students, the 8th and the 10th graders. And then also the data that ended up being used in that first study, they were using data that wasn't necessarily representative of California. So you have to be really careful about kind of making long-term comparisons with those. So for a number of reasons, they kind of called those findings into doubt. But I wanted to raise this because I do think this could come up as you have more discussions. So in terms of, if you kind of go down this pathway, obviously, and this is something Lynn alluded to, what other sanctions will be applied and what others will be offered? And then and then following that, what happens if people don't pay the fines? And here I want to raise an interesting example of South Australia. So in the late 80s, South Australia essentially switched from having cannabis possession be a criminal offense to a kind of on-the-spot ticket. So essentially, very similar to what ends up happening in most places in the United States. What ended up happening is over the next 10 years, the share of people that kind of got these tickets increased by 300%. But they didn't necessarily think it was because there was an increase in use. And so it kind of led, and then and then more people were getting tickets. They weren't paying the tickets. So then some of them actually ended up having to go to jail. So it kind of led to this net widening. Whereas before they kind of thought that the police officers, they didn't want people to get a criminal offense, so they weren't likely to kind of arrest them. But then once it became a civil fine, they were more likely to kind of give them a ticket. So this idea of net widening is something that you do need to pay attention to, and you're going to want to make sure that if you kind of go down this path, that you're collecting the right data on this. Because the last thing you want to do is kind of implement a policy that's is going to end up getting swooping more people into the criminal justice system. And also, how are you going to handle repeat offenses? In some places that have decriminalized, it's only for a first offense. In other places, it may be the first or second. This is going to be important. At what point do the criminal charges kick back in? And it may be the case that never. It could always be just a civil offense, but this is going to have important implications, especially for some of your heavy users who may be likely to get rearrested on more than one occasion. Also, what are the ultimate goals and how are you going to monitor them? I think Lynn alluded to the important idea of police contact. Now, it's easy for us to get data on arrests. A lot of places don't do a good job of collecting data on police contacts. So so maybe if something doesn't lead to an arrest, is that recorded somewhere? So I think that's something that you're going to want to think through, and then especially when we begin thinking about the racial disparities, in terms of who gets a ticket versus who doesn't. So I think you're going to want to keep really close attention or pay close attention to this. And then finally, are you going to include expunction or expungement for those with criminal records? This could have a huge effect. And just to kind of put this in perspective, we ended up doing some research for the state of Virginia and found that if you just looked at anyone who had been arrested for any adults for cannabis possession, if you were to expunge them, I think there were over 200,000 people that could have the record expunged, and of them, over 100,000 of them were people of color. So when you begin, especially when you begin thinking about social equity, this is a big deal. And then also the other question related to expunction is who's going to do it. It's one thing to allow this to be to be available, but if it requires people to go to court and potentially get a lawyer, that creates barriers. And so the other option, and this is something Lynn alluded to, was potentially allowing for some type of automatic expungement, which would put the onus on the state. So with that, I will close. I want to thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments, and look forward to talking to you now. And if over time you have any other questions or want access to or want any of these studies that I mentioned, please feel free to reach out. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn and Bo, for those excellent presentations. And Natalia, I'm going to kind of turn the floor back over to you.
Yeah, so I think I'll just open it up first to the task force members if you have questions for Dr. Silver or Bo, or if you have initial reactions about what kind of recommendation you think would be suitable for this group.
Representative Moore, if I can ask Dr. Silver a question. Dr. Silver, you mentioned motor vehicle related incidents increasing in certain states. Do you know if any of those motor vehicle incidents involved DWI, which was related to a marijuana impairment? Do you know?
I'd say, thank you, Senator. It's an excellent question. Clearly, use of marijuana causes impairment and increases the risk of motor vehicle accidents. Colorado has seen increasing numbers of motor vehicle accidents. I forget, was it accidents or fatalities where marijuana was implicated? However, there are a lot of issues around the data because at the same time, the amount of collection of data about marijuana use has been increasing. There are also still, unfortunately, a lot of methodologic problems in how you measure impairment. Because the correlation between blood levels and driving impairment is not as clear. And so I think there's a lot of research going on what's the best measure to use to understand when someone's impaired. So I would say there's, and Bo, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, there is some evidence that suggests concern about motor vehicle accidents, but there's not a huge body of evidence on this. But if use rates go up and daily use rates go up, which is what we are seeing in young adults particularly, I would expect that we would see more marijuana-related motor vehicle crashes, and an increased burden on law enforcement to monitor driving under the influence, to develop the appropriate screening methods that are accurate and reliable, and also the education campaigns and all the other things that go into that.
And Natalia, I don't know if you have this, or maybe one of our guest speakers, do we have any data related to marijuana-related motor vehicle accidents in North Carolina? Specifically to our state currently? It's okay if we don't, just wondering.
I don't. We can try. I don't know if Jasmine is keyed in. I know there was I just saw some discussion about the Department of Transportation. Jasmine, do you have anything?
No, but we can, as Natalia said, we can see what might be available from our partners.
Thank you.
I would add, Senator, that one thing
Yes.
we are seeing is a general decreased perception of risk from marijuana, and that includes people not being aware or thinking that there is not risk driving. People who are using medically, and also other people. So there, I think there was a recent national survey that looked at perception of risk around driving. I can try and find that and send it to the team.
That's fine. I mean, the reason I was just asking is I just want to see the actual risk to the community with marijuana use in general, for especially folks that are in a motor vehicle, to see the impacts of it either way. So I appreciate that.
Bo, are you aware of any data on that?
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, we're getting to the point to where we actually have some good studies coming out that actually have decent comparison groups. Because what you heard early on is, like, both in Colorado and Washington, a couple years after legalization, the share of drivers and fatal accidents that had THC in their system, increased dramatically. Okay. Now, the thing is that got a lot of attention, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the roads got less safe. As Lynn talked about, people had, THC can stay in the system for quite some time. And also it may have been the case that people were testing more for it. So if you're going to be objective about looking at, well, how do changes in cannabis policy influence road safety, you actually want to look at, well, what happens to the total number of accidents and the total number of crashes, right? Because we don't really have good measures with respect to THC. And it's also the case that we still don't know, well, how does legalization of cannabis influence the use of alcohol and other opioids, or opioids and kind of other drugs, in terms of, are people more likely to drive under the influence of cannabis, but then maybe less likely to drive under the influence of alcohol? I mean, we still don't know about that yet. And so that's why, to be objective, you want to focus on the total number of kind of fatal crashes. And so to briefly summarize that research, the early studies which looked at after legalization, after it was implemented, they didn't find much of an effect, but they were only focused on kind of the legal change. As we got more data, they began to look at, well, what happens after the stores open in legalization states? And they did find a small, potentially temporary increase. And then the most recent study to come out suggested it may have increased motor vehicle fatalities in Colorado, but not Washington. So, folks on both sides of this issue are going to hold up studies. Just know that this is very much kind of an emerging area of research. And also, most of the work is largely focused on Colorado and Washington. It's going to be time. It's going to take time before we get information on the other states.
Okay. Our staff sent us some numbers earlier, and I'm looking at, it's almost 35,000 folks were charged with marijuana, and almost essentially 66% that were convicted were non-white. And one of our things on this task force is I'm trying to see, how do we reduce people of color's contact with law enforcement at the end of the day, which leads to horrible things happening. And that's one of my biggest things, is at the end of the day, even if we decriminalize, so now if you have police officers just essentially issuing citations, civil penalties, we're still having contact with people of color, especially. That's just one of my biggest concerns if we stick with decriminalization. is the long-term consequences.
That's the value of legalizing small amounts.
Yeah.
for the communities,
Yeah.
But still creating the obligation to invest in prevention.
Absolutely. No, and I appreciated you, Dr. Silver, sharing the information about essentially nonprofit or an ABC model of regulation for marijuana if we were to legalize it, because that's the way I think North Carolina should go if we're going to do it. Heavy regulation similar to the ABC model to create revenue for our state and to also help with prevention and treatment. So I appreciate both of you.
Thank you. The one thing I would add, though, is one of the issues that states that have legalized are running into is that it's still illegal to consume in public.
Yeah.
Now, some places are allowing kind of cannabis lounges. We see an increasing number of them in California, and there isn't much research on them. But that's something to kind of keep in mind, that even when you legalize, if it's still going to be an offense for there to be public consumption, that still could be an issue, and especially with respect to racial disparities.
Appreciate it, Bob. Thank you.
Yep.
Could I ask, in my prior life was a district court judge, and especially juvenile court, and what Dr. Silver said, and watching the chronic use of kids in our juvenile delinquency system testing positive, and they were in there probably for something else, but also the psychosis that can result. And I guess that's now a proven medical statement that prolonged, consistent use of marijuana by younger teenagers or children does lead to that. I've seen that in my own family. The impact on juveniles is really a concern to me, and where it sets them up to go into possible addiction the rest of their life. I don't think any of us here are advocating for let's encourage people to smoke marijuana, but we're looking at the racial inequities that are so tremendous. I thought we heard 4 times as likely for people of color, 3.3% more likely for Blacks. And we need to fix that and look at records and how to give second chances and expunge. I think what you've showed is interesting. They went pretty drastically from a first misdemeanor offense with a criminal penalty and jail time down to $25 fines. And the dilemma of finding people and then they don't pay fines, and then does that lead them for failure to comply and loss of license and coming into court? So there's so much to juggle in this while promoting good health of all of our citizens. Should we separate the medical use of marijuana as well, the medicinal purposes versus decriminalize? So I see there are a lot of steps for us to go. We haven't addressed this at all. So would anyone give us the first 2-3 suggestions for good recommendations to how to tackle this problem?
I can certainly step in briefly just to talk about the memo that I prepared, whose main purpose, frankly, was to try to set out simply some concrete options to look at, so you're not just casting about without some concrete proposal on the table. And so if you look at the 3-page memo that I circulated, the first page summarizes current law, the second page sets out some options for you to look at, and the third page is a summary of the Virginia law that all of the speakers have referred to. So if you look at the second page, and especially at options A and C, but let me just briefly say, so option A essentially focuses on that class 3 misdemeanor possession of a ½ ounce or less of marijuana. Currently no jail time, but up to a fine. So option A would turn that into a civil offense with a lower fine, say $25 like Virginia, and also critically include an automatic expungement provision, which based on the numbers I would imagine once it took effect would potentially benefit tens of thousands of folks who have been convicted for this offense. Option B is the same as option A, except that it covers a higher possession level. It would go all the way up to 1.5 ounces, which is currently a class 1 misdemeanor. And then option C, picking up on some of the discussions with Lynn and with Bo, option C would say, well, let's do something a little bolder and actually have no penalty for possession of a half ounce or less. And so, you know, I think option A and option C present a nice contrast to each other, because option A, again, still having that fine, you've got a lot of vexing policy issues there. You've got to look at, if you're going to go with option A, you know, what is the amount of the fine? Can we come up with an alternative like community service? What if you have multiple offenses? What if you don't pay the fines? It creates that whole complex of issues that both speakers referred to. On the other hand, if you look at option C, which would say, okay, let's essentially legalize possession of less than half an ounce. You have the benefit of a cleaner solution, potentially a more impactful solution as far as racial disparities go, but you've got kind of a new set of complicated policy issues. So, you know, you're saying that possession of small amounts is legal, but presumably sale is still illegal. To pick up on Bo's question, you know, what about growing plants then? I mean, if you're saying it's legal to possess it, why can't I grow it? Or why can't I share it with family members or friends? How are you going to deal with that legally? And then you certainly get into the, I think, significant issue Bo raised, which is about public consumption. Right now, we don't differentiate between private consumption and public consumption because they're all illegal. But now if possession of less than half an ounce becomes legal, do you want to put anything in place for public consumption? And, you know, there's just also the broader concern that once you start down this path of legalizing any amount, you start to get into some of the difficult policy issues that Lynn touched on. And so I don't feel like my role here is to recommend one or the other so much as to try to set out some concrete options for you all to chew on. So I hope that is a helpful exercise, and that I'm not by any means the expert, but I hope it's at least helpful to set those options out for you to think about.
Bo or Dr. Silver, as far as the states that have legalized marijuana, can you tell me if they have seen any type of dramatic increases in criminal charges for other types of drugs, controlled substances that are illegal still in those states?
I have not seen that. There's been long debate about whether there's a gateway effect or not, and I think why there may be association with tobacco co-use. I think the evidence, I haven't been following that as closely. Bo may be more familiar with that, but I believe the evidence is not that strong for a gateway effect, that the National Academies of Science in their review did not conclude that there was substantial evidence of increasing. That was in 2017. So I don't know that it would necessarily exacerbate the opioid epidemic, for example. Neither is it effective in treating opioid addiction, although many people say it is. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think tobacco use has perhaps been the most common problem. I would just add a small comment. I think it was a comment that we got from our general counsel last time I was in government, which was, it is okay to regulate to solve a problem piecemeal. This is complicated and will take time, and we don't have to solve all of it at once. I think it's always been very interesting that the Dutch have lived with ambiguity, letting people smoke pot in cafes, but having production and cultivation and sale still be illegal for God knows how long. We're not really good at that ambiguity thing, but you know, maybe if we can reduce some of the devastating impact of racial inequity in arrests and possession, expunge criminal records, that's a good place to start. They can make an immediate equity difference, and maybe it'll take a decade or 5 years or a little longer to figure out all the legalization and plants or not plants and stores or not stores, or how you do the whole thing, and that's okay. But we should also not accept the injustice that is currently occurring, because the whole thing is complicated. It is.
Bo, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I'd say, Senator, most of the work that's been done on this is focused on medical cannabis as opposed to legalizing for all adults. Most of the research that's been done on legalizing for adults has focused on just arrest for cannabis. And as I alluded to, most of the work suggests that after a state legalizes, adult arrests go down, but youth arrests tend to stay flat. And then there's an example maybe of Oregon where it went up. No one's quite sure why. So yeah, but I mean, that raises this other issue too, that if you go down that pathway, how are we going to differentiate, possession for those who are below the age threshold? What's the penalty going to be for them? Or will it be some type of counseling or some type of health assessment? Because once again, those police contacts could still accrue. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Representative Moore, my biggest concern again is looking at it through the racial equity lens. And when I'm looking at these 2019 numbers alone, it's almost 35,000 folks just in 2019, and almost 70% of those convicted were people of color. And my only concern is if you do go that decriminalization route, you're still having significant contact at the end of the day with law enforcement for people of color.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, I know we're going to take those baby steps and potentially, like Dr. Silvers talked about. And look, and I'm going to be very honest with you, we just had an election in North Carolina. So we're definitely going to have to move with baby steps if we're going to even move towards legalization in our state. But on this task force, I want it to be something of a guiding light for our state, so we can create more racial equity in our system. So it's gonna be tough to go towards legalization at this time, realistically speaking, in our state. But I just want to figure out the best way to reduce these types of disproportionate minority contact that law enforcement will have with people of color related to marijuana.
I would reiterate what Bo mentioned, which is deprioritization, which is a strategy I think you can do without legislative action. I think you can do it. I don't know about North Carolina law, but in California, many local jurisdictions took executive decision to deprioritize enforcement on marijuana possession, and approaches you could also.
No, it's my understanding. Look, I'm an assistant public defender as well, and the way I've seen it, it looks like we're beginning to prioritize these types of charges a lot less, even especially towards prosecution. But again, when I see such significant numbers just for 2019, I'd have to go back and look at older numbers to see how much we've reduced it. But I just think 35,000 is a significant number of individuals still coming into contact. Obviously, the expunctions, it's going to be a great way to go as far as these types of criminal charges and deprioritizing, which I would hope we could include in our recommendations, Representative Moore.
Mohammed, sorry.
I was just going to say, for situational awareness, working group 2 is considering the de-emphasize piece of this in their policing investigations recommendations. So we'll keep you posted on what happens there.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts I've had, and I'll tell you, I'm a 31-year prosecutor, and I really appreciate the presentation. And Lynn, I've got to tell you something that you mentioned that really hit me. So I grew up in the eastern part of the state, worked in tobacco from the time I was born until I got out of high school. It helped pay for me to go to college. And nobody had to tell me that tobacco was dangerous, because I worked in it, and at the end of the day, my hands were completely black with tar. And you mentioned that years ago, they used to talk about tobacco being healthy. And sometimes I listen to these old classic radio shows from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And believe it or not, it's hard to believe today, but they used to advertise cigarettes as being good for your respiratory health And Chesterfield's had an advertisement that said it was recommended by 3 out of 4 doctors. And my concerns, number one, I want us to decriminalize, legalize marijuana in North Carolina. But I do think we have to create a liberty for a couple of reasons. One, I'm concerned a little bit about the message it sends about marijuana being harmless, because I don't think marijuana is harmless. Anything that one way you bring it into your body is to smoke it, there are a lot of other ways it's dangerous for you. That's common sense. Your body's not made to suck things into your lungs and then exhale. I'm also a little bit concerned about what it might do for our driving while impaired, although we already see it in driving while impaired cases, and we're pretty good at handling that. So I just would tell the group, I think I agree we want to reduce the number of law enforcement contacts, but I think with both deprioritizing as well as decriminalizing, you can go a long way toward reducing the number of contacts you have. I do think, especially when we look at what happened last Tuesday down ballot in North Carolina and all across the country, I don't think, I think we're just going to be spinning our tires. It's nice to be aspirational, but you've got to be realistic at the same time. So I think we need to focus on decriminalization, but look at legalization in the future. And I think prosecutors are actually likely to embrace this, as long as we're careful with the expungement part. And here's what I mean. I think we'll all agree that these records should be expunged, but we're going to need the tools to do that, which we don't have right now. We've learned that with the Second Chance Act and several other things, that we're having to build these tools as we go, and it takes a lot of work. And then number two, we've got to make sure that when records get expunged, we protect records of people who are currently convicted of crimes. In North Carolina, we have a system that you look at a person's past record that gives you a prior record level for their current charges. And we don't want to be in a position where something gets expunged and it changes a record level from a couple years ago, and we're back in court talking about that. And there's a way around that. It's a pretty easy fix, but we've got to make sure we do that and let the DAs know we're going to do that, that it's not going to affect any of your old convictions on other crimes where possession of marijuana was used to establish a prior record. But otherwise, I would say from the DA's perspective, you'll see that they want something done on marijuana. Marijuana has become a real difficult thing for us to deal with in North Carolina because of the testing restrictions we have in my jurisdiction, which is one of, if not the most jurisdiction. We de-emphasized marijuana for years. We charge literally, when I say a handful, we have about 225,000 people in my district. We probably have less than 100 marijuana charges every year. So I think you can deprioritize and decriminalize, and it gets us down the road and maybe the road toward some legalization in the future.
And to DA Little's point about the expunctions issues, so the second chance included prosecutor initiated raise the age parity for folks who have adult records for crimes that they would not have if it raise the age had been in effect. And Code for America is helping us because there are tens of thousands of eligible expunctions, and the DA conference and a number of DAs across the state from both parties are working with us, and it's a lot of work, and we're having but the structure is in place for us to partner with Code for America to expand that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's important, just to let people know. Whenever the Second Chance Act passed, I knew it was going to be tough to actually implement, to do the expunctions and things, but we found out how much hard work that is. And so maybe that's going to give us the tools we need for this, but it's really been a heavy lift.
I know the DAs in California definitely wanted the opportunity to review the expungements for the reasons that you mentioned, sir.
Do Jim or others have thoughts on what is logical, like with decriminalization, what you favor, like a fine, a civil infraction without a fine? Because I think that, I mean, there is consensus that we can recommend something, some level of decriminalization now, while acknowledging the need for further study as we move towards legalization, knowing that that further study is going to need to pull in all of the public health expertise and groups, which is just not part of this current task force.
So Natalia, I support exactly that, and what DA Woodall talked about. I think we should talk about, as far as our recommendation being decriminalization of marijuana charges, deprioritizing, and then including in our recommendation some sort of potentially a legislative study or something about heavy regulation and legalization of marijuana. But that should be included in the recommendation as a long-term potential goal.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I'll tell you the options, just looking at option B, that's more or less the option that we have instituted in my district by the way we deprioritize marijuana. We've essentially taken away the misdemeanor marijuana charge here by policy, not by legislative action. And so for that reason, I favor option B that is shown here, because that's essentially what we're doing.
And option B goes up to 1.5 ounces.
Right.
So I know I saw in that PDF that was sent out, it included the class I felony, which is 1.5 ounces up to 10 pounds is a class I felony. And that apparently we had almost 2,457 charges. Out of that, 66% that were convicted were non-white. I don't know. Just want to hear from the rest of my fellow task force members. What do we do about those types of charges as well? Because I think that should be part of the decriminalization push as well. Marijuana in general. I mean, 10 pounds.
Yeah, I think that should be part of the study, but if we could get, consensus on the easiest slow steps that we take, and Commissioner Smith, we haven't heard from you yet, but.
Yes, I believe in decriminalization. I believe in expulsion, and looking at these number as far as disparity is concerned. Any win is better than no win, and I believe in taking small steps, and we can get there from here.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we need to add in here, but the medicinal purpose for use of marijuana for anyone under doctor's order, if that would come in with this or not. But I think that is something that is very palatable to many people that we need to address at some time. But
Representative Maury, it's Josh. Maybe we can put that in the study. I have less issue about that doctor prescription. It's just the states that go first with medical sales before they go to legalization is it ends up creating a whole retail infrastructure that then becomes very difficult to then change your regulatory sales model along the way that Dr. Silver was saying earlier. And so I really think that I like the decriminalization step first, and then how do you deal with sale if you ever wanted to go legalization, whether it's for medical or recreational? How do you deal with this sales structure? What Senator Muhammad was saying, I embrace wholeheartedly, which is it should just be heavily regulated. Regulate the THC content, regulate the packaging, regulate the advertising, regulate the location of where it can be. There's just so many things that need to be done before you go to that next step. And next thing you'll start seeing these, if you allow for medical purposes, popping up on the corner, these green signed marijuana things as if it's a healthy product, when we all know there may be some valid uses for some people, but when you put all of it together, it is not in the public health interest.
okay, we have one more presentation. I think Jim was going to talk about prosecutorial discretion, and then we'll hear that and try and wrap up.
And
Okay.
just to clarify, in the interest of respecting Bo and Lynn's time, do we anticipate circling back on the marijuana issue, or can we dismiss them at this point, or should we keep them hanging? I think they're amenable either way. I just wanted to be clear.
I think it would be better if we've got any more questions to go ahead and ask them so that they're not hanging around for this discussion that you really will have no interest in.
I have no additional questions for either. So thank you both for your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and if we can be of assistance in the future, feel free to call. We're supported by the Hilton Foundation to do exactly this work. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, are we ready, I guess?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of things I did want to mention, and I think everybody probably realizes this. It seems to me that work group number 4, they're working on a couple of things that kind of bleed over into this. For example, some of their discussions about habitual felon law and how prosecutors make those decisions to indict people as habitual felons and violent habitual felons. So some of the other working groups are working on some similar things. So I stayed away from that. I also wanted to tell you that I spent some time over the last couple of weeks talking to a lot of elected DAs individually about this topic. And there's a lot of differing opinions about how we should go about it. Of course, you understand in North Carolina, a district attorney is a constitutional officer, which means in a lot of ways you get to make your own decisions and there's very little oversight, which of course is the reason prosecutors are so powerful in the criminal justice system. And so a lot of prosecutors, and I won't deny that I have some of these feelings, you're always reluctant to give up some of that authority and power you have. And so one of the things I did in talking to a number of my colleagues, and I actually talked to a couple of retired DAs that I really respect about this, one of the things that kept coming up is that prosecutors need to learn about prosecutorial decision making. That's not something we do it every day, but we still haven't studied it, so we don't know a lot about it. And at one point in my discussion, I'm going to talk to you about a study that is going on in the state of North Carolina, going on nowhere else in the country, that all the state's prosecutors are working on. Has everybody had a chance to read my recommendations? Yeah, rather than walking through them completely, I guess the first thing I will tell you, the first recommendation that the North Carolina Conference of District Attorneys develop and provide education on cognitive bias in the criminal justice process for prosecutors, their staff, and officers of justice. The training will focus on investigation, charging, and prosecutorial decision making, and will include recognizing confirmational and implicit bias and reducing its impact. These programs will follow the recommendations of the American Bar Association and the National District Attorneys Association National Prosecution Standards to support the impartial, unbiased pursuit of justice. I've had a chance to talk with Peg Dorr, who's the executive director, and Kimberly Spanos, used to be Kimberly Overton, who do a lot of our education. And they are already working on a program to try to educate the state's prosecutors on implicit bias and how that is reflected in the way we do our jobs and the way we charge and ultimately prosecute people. So that's the basis of that recommendation. So first, I'd ask if there are any questions about that particular recommendation. And I also want to mention, I've mentioned this to a couple of folks, that the Conference of DAs, they do want to be involved in this, and They have been working on this for a while, not just recently, and you're going to hear about that in just a minute. One of the other issues that I think is really important, and everyone who works in the court system, Judge Morey, everyone, we're well aware of how underfunded we are. So one of my recommendations that North Carolina allocate additional funding to prosecutors' offices and to the Conference of District Attorneys in order to enhance data collection, technology, training opportunities, and staffing in a renewed effort to address racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And one of the problems we have in DA's offices, you might have this in public defenders' offices too, it's really difficult to ascertain what your own local data is. Everything we get is generally through the administrative office of the courts, and they do a really good job, but they can't always provide us with the data that we need to analyze what we're doing locally. I'm really fortunate in Orange County. We have hired a software company from Chapel Hill that has developed software for us locally. And it's only in Orange County at this point. It's not even in Chatham County. And I feel like that's really important for district attorneys to be able to look at their own data for their district to try to learn what that data tells them. We're always challenged on the technology front in district attorneys' offices. And training, although I think overall we do a pretty good job of training. I think whenever we start to get into racial equity training, that's going to require a lot more time and a lot greater effort on the training front. And I don't think that the funds, the resources are there for all that at this time. So that's the reason for that recommendation. Any questions about that recommendation? Can everybody hear me okay now? Okay, I got a chat that I was not being heard. The other recommendation was that North Carolina prosecutors have individual and collective goals of reducing and eventually eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system. They should use a variety of available tools, including but not limited to the following, to help achieve those goals. These are things that we've already talked about, some of the things we've just talked about today. I do think we have some tools that we could use today and that are being used in a lot of districts, but are really underutilized by prosecutors across the state. I don't think, even though locally in Durham and in Orange County and even in Chatham County, we've deprioritized low-level misdemeanors, and the best example is marijuana. I don't think that's happening across the state to the degree it could. I don't think there are many districts using pre-charge diversion and deflection programs. And one reason for that is there are a lot of districts that don't have the money to do it. Again, we've been lucky that Orange County has established an office, a department to help us do that. But I think that's something that we could encourage other districts to do. I will tell you that the Conference of DAs recently had a meeting, and Kate Finhagen from Orange County, who shared a PowerPoint with this group in one of our early meetings. She presented to the district attorneys on pre-charge diversion and deflection. So it is something that's moving forward. Also, I think post-charge diversion programs should be developed in all North Carolina prosecutorial districts. And if you notice, I said as examples, I said that the pre-charge diversion should happen, post-charge, or it should, programs should be considered. Post-charge diversion should be developed. And the reason I said that, the pre-charge diversion and deflection takes money and things and some resources that a lot of districts aren't going to have right now. Post-charge diversion programs, the law already allows us to do it, and we can already do it without the need for staff or further resources. So I think that's something that should be done. Then the other example I gave was using mass relief efforts. That's, for example, what we've talked about today with the expunctions. And we can certainly do that across the state, and it would help people. But that is another thing that we have found requires resources that we don't always have. With the Second Chance Act, we have seen what a heavy lift that's going to be. And without the help of some outside partners, it would be almost impossible to do in a meaningful way. So I just think that's really important. And that touches on the Second Chance Act. I think that's something that can help a great number of people in North Carolina, but prosecutors' offices need help to implement that in a meaningful way. You can implement it in a way that you get some headlines in a newspaper, but that doesn't affect a lot of people. And I always tell people the example. A few years ago, there was a huge article in the News and Observer about a mass expunction project in one of our big counties, and that several thousand people showed up. They did all this stuff, and at the end of when it was all over, 21 people had records expunged. 21 people out of thousands. And in order to make it meaningful, prosecutors are going to need help. Any questions on that recommendation? Okay, my next recommendation was that North Carolina should study and consider adopting reforms and/or legislation used in other states or used by the federal government that have been proven to reduce or seem likely to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system. North Carolina prosecutors should participate in studies and surveys on topics that are relevant to reducing and eventually eliminating racial disparities in the criminal justice system, including but not limited to prosecutorial decision-making studies and surveys. This goes back to my earlier presentation, and this is something that the Conference of DAs is working on. Both the American Bar Association, the National Association of District Attorneys have some guidelines for prosecutors, and we're trying to figure out how those might work with North Carolina law. Generally, it works just fine because some of those are more ethical considerations than legal considerations, but there are a couple of hurdles we have to come over because it doesn't apply across the board in North Carolina. The same thing with the state of Washington's guidelines, although it's something we want to look at and study. There are several things about those guidelines that simply don't apply under North Carolina law. And one of the big things that I wanted to let everybody know, we've talked a lot among the DAs about not fully understanding how we make our decisions. I don't mean that I can sit down. I had one of my ADAs give me Jeff Neiman. I said, I want you to come up with kind of a flow chart on how you make decisions. In about 2 days, he had a 7-page flow chart on how he makes decisions. So prosecutors know how they do it when they sit down and think about it, but what we don't understand is what influences some of our decisions. About 2 years ago, a professor at Harvard called me, and the reason he called me was because his father is a practicing attorney in Chapel Hill, and I've known his father for about 35 years. He called me and said that he wanted to do a study on prosecutorial decision-making, and a study that he didn't think had been done in the way he wanted to do it anywhere in the country. And he asked if I could get North Carolina prosecutors involved, and that he wanted to do it in North Carolina because he's a North Carolinian. So I did, and it has taken a while, but I think we've had about 80% of all the prosecutors in North Carolina, both elected and ADAs, now participate in the study. And we think it's going to be something that is different and has not been done anywhere else. So a study is going to come out of Harvard. I don't know when they're going to complete the study, that will use North Carolina and how prosecutors make their decisions as the basis of their study. And I will tell you that we had to push a few prosecutors and prosecutors' offices to get involved in this because it can be a little bit frightening to have somebody break your work down and look at it and tell you what you're doing that's not right and maybe where you're making mistakes. And they actually came and spent several days with my staff. 3 graduate students from Harvard spent about 3 or 4 days with my staff working on this. And then again, they've surveyed 3/4, probably close to 80% of the prosecutors in the state now. So I think encouraging prosecutors to participate in these kinds of studies and surveys is very important, because I think we're going to learn some things about the way we make decisions that we've never known before. And then the final thing was simply an acknowledgement that we should always recognize the rights of and the potential consequences to crime victims, survivors, and their families when any type of change or reform to the criminal justice system is proposed. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate it. Part of the training, you know, I mean, I know everyone remembers our first recommendation was robust training for all court officials, DAs, PDs, judges. And Jim, I'd take it further elaborating on that and the need for funding. You would like this to be separate recommendations?
Yeah, I would, because I think the training for prosecutors has got to be different.
Okay.
I really do. I think there's been very little work done in studying how prosecutors make their decisions. And when we get to decision points, what influences us? We can talk about we're influenced by a person's prior record level. We're influenced by the evidence, but what we can't talk about is what biases we have that influence us. I think the standard racial equity training, which everyone in my office has done, is very helpful, but I think there needs to be training that's specific for prosecutors, and I think the Conference of DAs they're the folks to do it for us.
DA Woodall, real quick, as far as a specific type of training for prosecutors across the state, do you have anything in your recommendations as far as, look, just like for our police officers, I think work group recommended, they said one size doesn't fit all, and you need a constant training or a constant reminder. And I think I talked about this with our work group as well. Do you have something like that to include, where it's not just once in a blue moon training that you have, and then of course it goes out your,
Right.
It's got to
Yes,
be.
I think what we would be looking at, of course, the DAs, every time a new ADA is hired, they go through a 5-day new prosecutor school now. Back in the days when Marcia and I went through it, I don't believe it was 5 days. I can't remember, but they've expanded that greatly. So part of this would be at the new prosecutors school. And then there would be a part of this that is a yearly requirement for all ADAs and DAs in the state, in addition to any state bar requirement. Again, what Peg and the folks at the conference have talked about is tailoring something specific for district attorneys and assistant district attorneys.
That's a great idea, something yearly. So thank you for that.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to say to Jim, that was a good report. You did a lot of brainstorming, and thank you for sharing with us that there is an effort out there for a study. At least you have 87% of the prosecutors involved in looking at how decisions are made. Not being in a position such as yours, I know there's a lot of things that go through, experiences and so many other things that weigh heavily on decisions as they're being made. And I think that I appreciate what you share with us and the training, I think it's going to be important that when this training is put together, you have individuals that are experts in the process. You have the advantage of actually being part of this group. You have the advantage of seeing some of the, across the state of North Carolina, some of the disparities when it comes to inequity. And I think that when this training is put together, some of the experts that we actually had opportunity to listen to over the last several months, that they weigh heavily on how least use those experts when it comes to putting this training together. Thank you, sir.
Well, and I will tell you that in all our training, we have a lot of outside trainers come in. We have a lot of folks, of course, within the state, but we do always have outside trainers, and we draw real heavily on the School of Government.
Yes.
Just as the judges do and the
Right.
PDs and others. So, we start with the conference that does really good training. We bring in outside experts from other states, and then we lean very heavily on the School of Government.
School of Government is a great place. It's a great organization, for North Carolina. Thank you, sir.
I'm looking, it's 5:38. We need to, unless anyone has some burning issues, it sounds like with our discussion on the marijuana and Jim talked about the option B, that maybe Natalia, we could do some simple recommendations, send them out. People vote up or down or comment, put Jim's recommendations, and then we'll be ready to go for Friday. Does anyone have any other thoughts that we were looking at the decriminalization, the deprioritization, the expungements? And
Representative Moore, just for me and just for Jasmine or Natalia, just again, just emphasizing the deprioritization with decriminalization, and then looking towards some sort of legislative study or some sort of study with heavy regulation for the legalization of marijuana in the future.
yes, sir. Everyone okay with that plan going forward? Natalia?
Yeah, I was just going to say I will do my best to capture this discussion today. I think there will be some open questions, so I'll kind of leave those in there, and we can just say, we recommend that these considerations be looked at, but take a look at what I end up sending, and if you want to be more specific on any of those points, then just let me know.
Great. And we had great speakers. Thank you for arranging that. Lynn, I see your name still on here. Steve, the memo you sent to all of us is a really great guiding document. And just really appreciate everyone just hanging in there. Hope you have a really good night.
Thank you all.